Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Thompson. This is going to be a chapter 9 for the ethics course lecture. This is the ethics of criminal justice policy making. So one of the most important ethical decisions that are made in the criminal justice system is the making of a policy. And even a police officer kind of makes the policy, or a probation or parole agent, they kind of make their own policy, because while the law says one thing, they get discretion on when and how to enforce the law. For instance, a policy is essentially a law, or it can be. If the legislature says we want to pass a law that says this is illegal or that is illegal, for instance, something as minuscule as having an inspection sticker on your vehicle. You buy a new vehicle, inspection sticker comes with it, it's good for 2 years now. But let's say you've got a poor person who goes to get an inspection sticker and they can't get one because their windshield is cracked. And so a police officer might see that they don't have one and then issue them a $200 or $300 ticket. The windshield itself would be $500 or $600. Their insurance doesn't cover it. So it just kind of perpetuates this problem where, while the law says it's illegal, the enforcement of that law may not, an officer may choose not to enforce that particular law under those circumstances. So everybody, even when the policy is made, has some level of influence on how it's carried out. For instance, you might have a policy that says don't use profanity with the public, but the chain of command refuses or doesn't care about that, so they just ignore that particular policy even when they see it, allowing unprofessional behavior to go forward. So we'll start with the moral panic. And a lot of policies in the criminal justice system, whether it be a law or the response to an incident, are based on a moral panic. Something big happens, like a child gets kidnapped, and they're like, well, there should be a law. There should have been a law that prevented that. Another one is, or one of the very common ones that everybody complains about. So, for instance, you have somebody who's out of prison on parole or probation, and they could be in prison, but it was a choice to let this person out instead of serving all their time behind bars. And then they commit a crime, and everybody, including me, is wondering, well, why was this person even out of jail? And the reason is very simple. We make these policies, we write these laws, such as mandatory minimum sentences, and people get put in prison for a very long time. And there's, for instance, certain sex offenders, they get out earlier than people who are convicted for drug crimes. And I think that's insanity, but that's our policy, that's our law. So by law, if you have a rapist, a forcible rapist, somebody who threatens somebody with a weapon, holds a woman down and forces himself upon her, raping her, that person is required to spend less time in jail than someone who's in possession of a handful of drugs in the state of Louisiana. That's our laws. That if you don't like it, get them to change, but that is the reality of it. So but people wonder, well, why aren't why isn't something done? And if they are let out, why don't we monitor them better and stuff like that? So they put a lot of scrutiny now on probation and parole agents. And there's, they'll pass a law or policy that says you must do a home visit. This person must come in. You must make sure that this person is not actually out there harming anybody in the public. And it's kind of comical because, while they change the law, they say, hey, you need to do X, Y, Z. I've spoken with many probation parole agents over the years and researched the caseloads that they have. And you'll find they'll have more than 100 sex offenders on their load. And that's 100 people to supervise who are out in the community with no supervision. They're supposed to do home visits and so forth. Like, for instance, I'll give you a personal story of a probation parole agent that I spoke with. He goes to work for a probation parole agency, had a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, and was ready to make a difference in the world. He gets there, and they give him a caseload of about 175. About 60 of those offenders required home visits once per month. Mandatory, no way around it. You weren't allowed to use your personal vehicle to do those, and that would obviously be a great personal expense to the probation parole agent. It wouldn't be fair to, make the probation parole agent pay for the gas and pay for the wear and tear on the vehicle. So we're supposed to use a company vehicle or a probation parole state vehicle. The vehicle is only available to each probation parole agent 1 day per month, because the vehicles that were available were being used for people to go to the state capitol to do different things. I'm not going to say which state this was. I'm trying not to give it away, but they were not available because of administrative stuff and people using them. So, but 1 day a month, a probation parole agent could get the vehicle, sometimes for only half a day, to do 50, 60, 70 home visits of predators. And this particular probation parole agent said, well, that's not possible. How are these other people doing this in one day? You know, you probably can't even check 10 people in one day. And the response was, no, you don't do them, you just write them down. So this is basically a law says you must visit, but they just wrote it down. So this particular probation parole agent, frustrated but obeying his chain of command, went and did, it was his day to use the car. So he sat in his office and wrote down that he went to all these places as he was commanded to do. The following morning, he was written up for writing down that he went to these places but not actually going to them. He wasn't terminated, which I think that was anybody caught saying, I went to this sexual predator's house, went to the house and made sure there was no children being held in the basement or whatever, or made sure there wasn't an active rape going on. That should be termination on the spot. But they didn't terminate him. They just wrote him up, said you failed to do them, so here's your little write-up. Nothing. I don't even think it was a permanent write-up. And he said to his supervisor, you just told me to do this yesterday. I did exactly what you said to do. They said, yes, that's what we told you to do, but you did not write down that you did not log miles on the car. You didn't take the car from the office. And he said, you have to put miles on the car, because if there is an audit, they're going to see the car wasn't driven that day in the log. And he said, well, what do I do with the car? And they said, oh, go shopping, just put some miles on the car so we can say that you actually left the office and put miles on the car. More insanity. That's they policymakers sometimes get these great ideas and say, oh, we need more supervision, but there's no tools to actually make it happen. And that was one of the examples. So this particular probation parole agent, he did end up quitting because, that was basically what they were doing. And J.C. Dugard, who was in the state of California, I'll talk about her numerous times in the course. She was kidnapped at 9 years old, held in captivity for 18 years. She was visited by probation parole agents 63 times, and she was never discovered. And this was after she was kidnapped. She was visited by PMP 63 times. Even one of those a several month period during that, the person that kidnapped her was actually put in prison and held for several months. And the wife of the kidnapper, he held her in captivity until he got out and continued his sexual torture, and ended up having 2 children with his victim. They're free now, and they're living a good life. Her in California, and her children are attending universities overseas in different places. So anyway, but that's another example of, we've got probation parole officers, and I'll talk about this more in that section, writing down that they did the job, which basically means the job is replaced by the procedures. We just write down that we did the job, and that's the job we're supposed to accomplish, but that doesn't attribute to anything. My basic point is that any policy should have a noble goal. It should have a desired outcome that should be actually attainable, not just, hey, let's write this down, write down that we did it, hope nothing bad happens. And that's kind of what we're seeing today, especially when we start auditing state employees who are supposed to do it. Even Governor Jindal several years ago in the state of Louisiana, under his administration, they were approved to do driveway checks for children in foster care. They're supposed to go in and check and make sure the children are safe, but they were approved to do driveway checks where they would just pull into the driveway, say, hey, are y'all okay, and then leave, never actually go into the house. And that's obviously not going to work. So when these things happen, a moral panic ensues, and they start implementing laws. Serial killer, the crack epidemic, active shooters, so forth and so on. So in response to that, a lot of times it will be mandatory minimum sentences. So California kind of led the way for this. They got tired of these repeated felons committing crimes over and over again, so they wanted the option of 3 strikes laws. 3 strikes laws basically put someone in prison for 25 years to life, and essentially they'll never get out. With that said, any law should be at least founded in research or and a constant evaluation of that. And I'll give you a little hint. Basically, men who are full of that stupid hormone called testosterone have a higher. The more testosterone you have, the higher tendency of criminality you have. So when men typically age out of crime, young males up until they start reducing their testosterone levels, it's called aging out. So keeping somebody in jail for 25 years to life is not statistically an effective method, where a more statistically effective method would be to keep them in jail until they hit the age for which they are less likely to commit a crime, essentially until they, us men don't mature until much later in life, and then we decide, hey, let's stop doing stupid things. Luckily for me, the stupid things that I do are legal, like flipping over airplanes, jumping out of airplanes, joining SWAT teams, building explosives for the government legally, stuff like that. I was able to get out my, we'll say, stupidity in a legal way, joining the military. With that said, they said, oh, well, let's do something about these habitual offenders, and they started putting them in jail, and it helps to keep somebody incarcerated for the term of their peak criminality by age, hormone levels, or whatever the case may be, but just a blanket policy of that was not necessarily supported in the research. People got scared during the pandemic. I'm sorry, not the pandemic, during the crack epidemic. There was just this fear of this drug war in the USA. Drug markets were open. It was kind of before the internet. People stood outside and just sold drugs in the open market, and they fought each other, and gang violence and stuff like that. And it resulted in people getting really, tired of the drug war, or tired of the drug problem. So they started cracking down on it, and they started issuing mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. That resulted in a massive explosion of our prison system. They just kept building prisons, and it didn't work. They just kept filling them up, and we still have a drug problem. And if you've been living under a rock for the past 50 years and don't know what's going on even today, we still have a drug problem today. Our efforts to win the drug war so far have failed. We're finally starting to shift in the right direction. And I think a part of that is the moral panic right now. That the major issue we're seeing is regular people have started getting addicted to pain medications, and which in the form of, they've always been addicted to pain medications. Let me make that clear. But let's back up and go a little historical a bit. There was a company that was making oxycodone. They put it out as, hey, they push doctors to prescribe it left and right. So somebody, a good person, man, woman, white, black, whatever, would go in, let's say with a broken arm. Their arm would break, and they would get a cast or whatever treatment, but they would be given pain medication. And instead of being given something that would work well enough, like something stronger than Tylenol, but they started pushing the oxycodone. Oxycodone is extremely powerful and very, very addictive drug. So this person would get addicted to that, and it would ruin their lives, all the way to the point of losing their job because they were couldn't function while they're on the drugs. But the thing of it was, they were getting these from pill mills, we call them. They would go after their regular doctor would no longer prescribe it, even though the regular doctor was highly rewarded for giving it. Eventually that doctor would no longer give it in the quantities that they need to maintain their level of addiction. Doctors in Texas and Florida, they were notorious for this, and other states as well, but Texas and Florida especially, because I dealt with this personally. People going to Texas, they would go to the I-10 clinic, and they pull in, they pay cash, no insurance, and just walk in and say, my back hurts and my feelings are hurt because of my back hurting. And they would give them Xanax for the anxiety associated with their back pain. They would give them hydrocodone or oxycodone for their back, and they would give them Soma, which is a very strong muscle relaxer for their back. And they'd pop all three of these pills at the same time, and then driving back to Louisiana, they would get in a crash or be all over the road, and they get arrested. I saw several people killed that way. In fact, one of the cases that I worked, a teacher was driving to school in the morning. This is 8 o'clock in the morning, or before. She's trying to get to school, and this guy crosses center line. Before he crossed center line, though, there was like 7 people on 911 trying to get this guy stopped. I was on my way there. I was doing 120 miles an hour, but shortly before my ability to get there and intercept the vehicle, there was a crash, and it killed a teacher, and it also killed the person who was driving. They was on the pills. Anyway, so they finally cracked down on that. There's major lawsuits involving the company that pushed out the oxycodone. We're going to feel the effects of that for a very long time. But they finally said, okay, all these doctors, you're not going to be able to prescribe this like that anymore. So they stopped. But, once they stopped, they didn't have a methadone treatment in place for all these people who are not going to be able to get those pills anymore by just driving in and walking into a doctor's office. And so they said, well, I still got to get high. I still got to get my fix. What am I going to do now? That's why we have the pandemic. I keep saying the pandemic, the COVID. That's why we have the epidemic we have today with opioid addiction. Instead of just popping some pills, which is bad, but is nowhere near as bad as fentanyl and carfentanil. So fentanyl is a much more powerful. It can be made synthetically, and the carfentanil method that's shipped over from China it takes very little to overdose. So as of 2023, over 100,000 people a year are dying from opioid overdoses in the form of, we got heroin that came back with a major blast, but heroin comes from a plant. It's hard to, that's kind of labor intensive. Whereas now fentanyl is much easier to get, much cheaper to get. For a few $1,000s, you can end up becoming a drug dealer. And if you don't get caught, very successful one if you're looking for a good return on your investment. Anybody going to put this on you? It already is on YouTube. If you're going to call Fox News or CNN and say this professor of criminal justice is recommending people to become a drug dealer, I'm not doing that. Don't say that. That's a lie. But I am telling you how criminals operate. If you cannot think like a criminal, you cannot catch criminals. If you think like a good person and don't think of all the negative and bad things to do, like being a drug dealer, stealing, embezzlement, stuff like that, you can go out and catch good people. Well, they don't need to be caught. We need to catch bad people. So you got to think like a criminal. With that said, moving on. The U.S. cracked down on these prescription medications, got rid of them. So the end result of that policy is, instead of 20, I don't know the stats prior to the fentanyl taking over for the pain medication, because people are going to get their fix. But it wasn't 115,000 a year. That's what we're looking at now. That's a massive issue. Morgues are being overrun with dead people from not just, it was a problem during COVID, just the COVID epidemic, but morgues were already being run over with people who were overdosing from opioid abuse. Opioid falls under the pain medication category: hydrocodone, oxycodone, fentanyl, carfentanil, and heroin, morphine, stuff like that. Basically everything but Tylenol. We are still fighting the war on drugs, and that was kind of a part of the war on drugs, that policy to get rid of those, to get rid of the opioids. But let's change it to another policy. In Louisiana, Texas, rural USA, you had a lot of people starting to, they're like I said, they want to get high. They're going to find a way to get high. Cocaine's very expensive, but it's still attainable. But they were looking for a cheaper way, so people in their trailers and houses and basements started becoming scientists, we'll say, and started trying to make methamphetamine. And they made it successfully. It's made out of Drano. I'm not saying I don't really trust a guy that that didn't graduate high school in his camper, that makes methamphetamine from lithium-ion batteries and ether bought from Walmart, and and they had explosions, kids exposed to it, just a massive nightmare as far as doing it. But it took a lot of work to make just a little bit, and it was very detrimental to your health. Obviously, that's the people with their teeth falling out. But you had all these meth labs everywhere. So the U.S. knee-jerk reaction said, "Oh, we're going to crack down on these meth labs," and I'm guilty of it. I've raided meth labs. I've stopped rolling meth labs. I've put people in prison for centuries, if not close to millennia, or assisted putting people in prison for hundreds, if not thousands of years over all the cases I've either done myself or assisted with, including methamphetamine, cocaine, painkillers, stuff like that. U.S. cracked down on it. So people were like, well, it's harder to make a meth lab. The cops know what to look for. You can smell it when they're starting to cook it. But there's still a massive demand for methamphetamine in the USA. So it gives you a euphoric effect. It's a stimulant, somewhat hallucinogenic. People like it. People don't take drugs because they don't like them. They take drugs because they make them feel good, at least at that moment. Again, if you put me on one of these news agencies saying Steve Thompson says drugs are awesome, they're not, but we got to be realistic about it. People don't take them because they make them feel bad. They take them because they make them feel good. They like the way methamphetamine made them feel. They still wanted to get it. Well, when you have a demand for something, somebody's going to be a supplier. if there's something that people want to buy and nobody's selling it, for instance, people wanted to buy flight time. So I have a personal business and I sell flight time. I sell flight instruction. I rent airplanes to other people so they know how to fly. Nobody was selling it where I live, and so I decided to sell it. People want methamphetamine. I did not decide to sell methamphetamine, although it's very profitable if you don't get caught. With that said, the government cracks down on it. There's a major demand for it. So the Mexicans decided, well, cocaine is cocaine, especially marijuana, illegal drugs, getting them into the country, it's hard. They take up a lot of weight. Well, methamphetamine's not that heavy, and your return on investment, the number of people you can get high with a small amount of methamphetamine versus bales of marijuana, it's a lot more profitable. So they said, well, let's see if we can make methamphetamine. So these drug cartels, Mexican drug cartels, are now the supplier of methamphetamine. When I would make a methamphetamine bust, I was lucky to get an ounce, and that was like a huge deal. I'd get a call from the colonel saying, hey, good job, you got all this methamphetamine off the streets, and it was, this much that you could fit in your hand. Now it's coming in kilos and hundreds of kilos, sometimes tons. They're making it in massive amounts. So now if you want methamphetamine, because they shut down the methamphetamine labs, and shut down the meth labs was a good thing, but it had the unintended outcome of saying, well, the Mexicans are going to make it in mass and then send it over here. So now it's better quality, it's cheaper, and it's easier to get. So that's kind of an example of a knee-jerk reaction. Same thing with getting rid of the prescription pain medications. It's now more powerful and killing more people because they can't get it from a regular doctor, where I think it's time to think about when you want to eliminate the access to pain medication. If somebody comes in addicted to it, I'm not saying we should, tell these doctors, hey, you should go back to issuing oxycodone or whatever. But I think it would be very beneficial to say, okay, if somebody's needs this and is addicted to it, they need to have immediate and easy access to methadone to wean them off, to start the addiction recovery process. And methadone is an alternative. It is a powerful painkiller, but it is also used to gradually wean people off of their opioid addiction. So that's just something we should think about. The criminal justice system doesn't seem to be working that well for it. So, again, we've been in the war on drugs for over 50 years, and it's filled a lot of prisons, but it just hasn't worked. A lot of, back in the 80s and 90s, to say drug dealer was kind of synonymous with saying child molester or rapist or the worst kind of person in the world. So it became politically popular to crack down on the drug problem. And that's political popularity is not always what works. Responding to predators and super predators. So people, especially sexual offenders, a lot of people think that, and some of you I don't even like the things that I'm about to say. So if you're going to call the news media and tell them I said this, make sure you tell them I don't like the things that I'm about to say, but I'm a criminologist. A lot of people assume that the recidivism rates, the recommission of a crime rate for sex offenders, like when they get out, they're going to go back to raping people. If we look at the rates, sex offenders have the lowest level of recidivism in pretty much all crimes. I think it's around 4 or 5%. It's very, very, very low. So the typical rearrest and incarceration rates for all offenders is over a 5-year period is around 70 or so percent. It's ridiculously high. But for sex offenders, not so much. And I got a couple problems with that. And basically, I'm a human being, and when I see a person victimized sexually, I think, why would they ever even have the opportunity to offend again? But they do because of our laws. The laws are written. Oh, you can put this person in prison for rape for up to 2 years. You have to do 2 years, but that's it. You don't have to give them any more time. But if they get caught with a handful of cocaine, it's 5 years. Just a handful. We're talking 28 grams, just a little more than an ounce. Yeah, they're probably selling. But why are they selling? Because we want it. We want to buy the cocaine. We want to use the cocaine. There's somebody out there wanting to buy it. Somebody's going to sell it to you. So again, that person has to do more time in jail than the sex offender. Of the cases that I work personally, I always saw the drug offenders go to prison for longer periods of time. than any sex case I ever worked. Not one single case got more than the drug offenders. In fact, I used a confidential informant to go into a house to buy drugs on 3 occasions. It was oxycodone, pills. They went to Texas to these pill mills, bought the pills, brought them back, and sold them. On those 3 occasions, there were 2 pills bought on the first time, 2 pills bought on the second time, and I think 1 pill bought on the third time. So we're at 5 pills. 45 years in prison. Mandatory, no parole, 45 years. And that took a lot of bed space for sex offenders. That took probably 10 sex offenders that could have done 2 years each. Or let's do the math on that. We'll say that took 4 sex offenders that could have done 10 years each. But he was in jail taking up 4 places, basically, for those sex offenders. So I don't like that. I think I would rather let the first I'd rather let the first drug dealer out before I let the first rapist out. But that's not the way our laws are written. That's policy making. In my mind, in my heart, that is unethical. But when it becomes politically popular, they do it and then they forget it. And you're thinking, oh, well, just change it. Increase the mandatory minimum for sex offenders. Can't do that. We don't have the room. Okay, well, we would have the room if we would go back and reduce the mandatory minimum for drug crimes. And you're like, oh, that's a great idea. And we can do that, but nobody will. Very seldom will they, because the first time a politician writes the law and puts it and says, hey, let's vote on this, his opponent in the next election is going to say, look, Steve Thompson's running for Congress, or Steve Thompson's a congressman. He wrote a law that says we're going to go take it easy on all these drug offenders. He's putting drugs on the street. When really what he's doing is making room for sex offenders and taking rapists off the street. But people don't hear that. These misleading political ads, that's the way it works. So we're kind of stuck. Governor John Bel Edwards actually announced that he was going to do that in his campaign. He said he was going to release roughly 5,000 nonviolent drug offenders. That was going to free up 5,000 prison spaces in Louisiana to improve our ability to put away violent offenders. And that was a great thing. But sure enough, what did his opponent do? David Vitter, he attacked him. He showed a little white girl sitting on her couch, and she goes and opens the windows and sees all the black drug dealers that John Bel was going to let out on the street. That was literally his campaign ad. And he almost became the governor of the state of Louisiana. This is the same person who was caught using prostitutes in Washington, D.C. So again, he almost became our governor. It's sad to say that that's the best that our state could come up with at the time. I'm very sad to say that. With that said, that's what I'm getting at is it's hard to change these policies, but there should be an ethical motivation. Recently, I believe Louisiana has changed the law where now, if you're caught with marijuana, which would normally result in you getting thrown in jail, now it's just a ticket. There's no more booking people in for possession of marijuana, which was a lot of the drugs that people were put in jail for. One of the reasons was it's easy to find. You can smell it from a mile away. You stop a car, somebody smells like it, boom, you got them. They got a roach in the ashtray, boom, you've got your drug arrest. The officer says, hey, I made 45 drug arrests this year for whatever, possession of marijuana. He gets an award. But what impact did that officer actually have? And I don't want to take away from the work of narcotics officers. I work narcotics. I've kicked in a lot of doors for drug cases. I've been riding around in a undercover vehicle with 40 pounds of hydroponic marijuana in the back seat. I even got stopped by a police officer with it in the back, him not knowing we were police officers because it was an undercover vehicle. We were dressed undercover. Luckily, when they walked up to the car, they recognized who we were, and we went about on our business. Like I said, it was 40 pounds, and as far as you know, we were going to turn it in. So, but as far as you know, I'm not going to tell you what we actually did with it. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. So, we're not going to talk too much more about the predators and super predators, but I just want to remind you that criminals age out. So incarceration has an effective window. So too long is wasteful, too short is not enough. And that's where the research comes in. And the sad thing is, when, let's say you make that window, you keep them in jail this amount of time. Well, and you let that person out just after they were supposed to be. If you would have kept every single one of those people in jail, then some of those people are going to get out and commit a new crime. But we have to look at this statistically, because we cannot keep them all in jail. But what we can do is make it as efficient as possible with every bed space we have. And we're coming around to it as far as the drug war. we're eventually going to stop putting people in jail for possession of drugs. We're probably going to stop putting people in jail for drug distribution. Probably. That's a long way off, and I'm not recommending that. I like putting drug dealers in jail. It's a criminal enterprise, but what I like even more about catching drug dealers is their money. I want their money. We can take that money and use it to pay officers. We can use it for equipment to fight the people that they're taking to jail. And most importantly, and I think is the best option, is to use that money from these drug dealers and pay for drug treatment for the people that are addicted to the product that they're selling. So, but when you take one drug dealer and put him in jail for 30 years, do the math on that. 30 times 30, $30,000 a year incarceration. That's a whole lot of money. That's $900,000. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's around up, just under $1 million. $1 million will pay for a whole lot of people to go to drug treatment. So I think that's a better option. Quick comment just on capital punishment. Capital punishment is a policy, and it's a law that is allowed in some states. Right now, the only thing that the Supreme Court would allow a person to be executed for is for murder. Whereas if a person is not killed, then they can't be executed for the crime that they commit. Louisiana has laws on the books today that say if you commit a rape of a child under 12, it is punishable by death. That law is not enforceable. The U.S. Supreme Court got rid of that law in the case of I forgot. It was in, I think, 2008 in Louisiana. They got rid of it and it's gone. But my understanding is Florida is now attempting to make it a death penalty punishable for rape of children as well. And that will go forth in front of a new Supreme Court if they can get it there. And then the new Supreme Court, again, as the justice changes, their ideology may change, and it may become an option to execute somebody for that crime again. Me personally, as far as executing someone for the crime of rape of a child under 12, I personally support it. I personally want it to happen. I want retribution. I want to send a message to that criminal that if you mess with our children, you die. That's a father talking. That's a man talking. It's a citizen talking. As a criminologist, and if I were to step away from that, that is not the price it takes to execute someone is so expensive. It's actually much more expensive to execute somebody than it is to put them in jail to put them in prison for life. So from an economical standpoint, it's not the death penalty for any crime. It's not good policy because it takes so long. Right now it's broken. It takes an average of 14 years on death row before you can carry out a death sentence. So 14 years, we talk about deterring people. Deterrence is supposed to be swift and immediate. Well, 14 years later is not swift and immediate. We have a death penalty case in Calhoun Parish. A man shot and killed a state trooper. He was convicted, sentenced to death, I think at least twice. They got a retrial on the penalty phase. The crime is on video. He planned to do it. He made a plan to do it, and he did it. The trooper had no chance. I'm one of the few people who have seen the video. I was an expert witness on the case, but he's elderly. He looks in very poor condition. He was old when he committed the crime. Chances of him actually being executed, I think, are very small. He'll end up, appealing, or if you're not healthy enough, they won't do it. So again, he's still sitting on death row as of February 11, 2023, and still there. So from an economical standpoint, it's not a good idea. But again, if they do bring back the death penalty for a person who rapes a child under 12, if the Supreme Court allows that, criminologist perspective, that's not a good idea. Because it doesn't serve as a deterrent effect. That's just what the research shows. But as a father, so I have to weigh, which one do I go with? Do I go with my experience as a criminologist and knowing the numbers, or do I go with my personal feelings as a father and as a man? So in this particular instance, I have to choose. I'm going to choose kill him. That's my personal opinion. You may have a different one. That's perfectly acceptable. If you express that to me, I will respect your opinion and tell you my side. You tell me your side. And again, we're going to respect each other's opinions if you decide to have this conversation. I think too much in our society, when someone has a different ideology than us, it turns into an argument when it doesn't need to be. Republican, Democrat, I don't know, your favorite football team versus the other football team. You suck because you like this. We become a divisive society when we should be the same. And I've seen so much of that. And I think most the people who feel that the way, the people who think, well, if you don't think the way I do, then you're bad. Well, that, to me, that person is not a person who respects democracy. That is a person who wants a dictator. They want everybody to be like them, and that's not the USA. I don't want, for instance, gay marriage or homosexual relationships. They were illegal for a very long time. And if you were, it was a crime, and definitely could not get married. And while I'm a heterosexual, I have to look at that from a freedom perspective. I believe people should be free to do this is my personal opinion. I believe people should be free to do what they want to do, because I don't want to tell to other people what they can and cannot do in their own bedroom. And I don't want anybody else telling me what I can and cannot do in my own bedroom. If there's no victim, it should be no issue for anybody else. While you may not like it, you may not do it, you may not support it, for me, it's about freedom. So if too many people out there like, well, if you're not a Democrat, you're not really an American, or if you're not a Republican, you're not really an American. People who think that way and express that ideology really don't want democracy. They want everybody to be like them, which means they want a dictatorship, and that's not what this country's about. So there's my, I went from talking about policy and death penalty and all that to, we'll say, some more political discussions. But that's all I have for the chapter 8. We'll see you in chapter 9.